Let's see if this works. It does. And so it's a pleasure to be here at the Athens Roundtable. This is a picture of Athens, as you can see. And in the picture of Athens, this is obviously not a photograph of Athens. There's a statue holding a sword and a shield. Several. Now, of course, Sparta was militaristic. Here we are at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. So it's appropriate to talk about not defense tech, but what I call PeaceTech, or what my colleagues refer to me as saying career suicide. Okay, so the sword and shield is a very good metaphor because, of course, in military history, they think of it in terms of the sword and the shield. There are some technologies that favor the offense, and there's some technologies that favor the defense. In Kissinger's book on artificial intelligence, he makes this point, and he says that the trebuchet favors the offense, and technology around moats and fortifications favored the defense. So the question then becomes, what does AI favor? Will AI favor the offensive weapon, or can be AI used for the defensive? Or is that not really the right question? And the reason why we're riveted by this is because of World War I. It was the moment in which the Industrial Revolution met the military, and for the first time, the whole nature of war had changed. And that's why at the Battle of the Somme, for example, you had an environment in which you had 100,000 casualties within the first 24 hours. This had never happened in warfare before. The campaign was about 4 months long. It cost about 1 million lives of the soldiers on both sides. That's unbelievable. 1 million lives. The frontier moved 8 kilometers for no military advantage, and the war continued for another 2 years. So what will happen today with AI and the new weapons that we have? We have lethal autonomous weapon systems, loitering munitions that just simply get put into the sky. They have image recognition, and they can swoop in to find the enemy aircraft or other object that it wants to destroy. Even remote detonation, like we saw with Hezbollah. So where the world is talking about defense tech, we accept the idea 20 years into the internet and social media that we can have a technology that has a lot of promise, yet it can have vice too as well. Well, can we imagine it in the opposite direction, reframe it, that there's technologies that seem pretty odious, like a weapon system that's now a smart weapon with AI, and we can turn it into virtue and turn it into something better. PeaceTech being technologies that prevent, mitigate, or resolve conflict. Now, when you add technology to something, you change that thing. I don't need to tell you all here in the audience that. But let's just remind ourselves that if you add a chip, then a network, and AI to a phone, the phone becomes a cinema. You add it to a car, you have to redesign the interior of the car. You still need a windshield wiper. The windshield is actually now just a window, right? But the cannonball didn't have a chip. You didn't have a microprocessor on every single howitzer shell. But you will be putting these technologies into the drone. So what's going to be in it? Now, over the past several years, we have been, for several centuries, if you date it back, but really since the 1860s and 1940s, we have developed the Geneva Conventions and other areas of international humanitarian law. And it basically distills down to 3 principles: distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Most important is distinction, civilian versus combatant. And I would pose the question, and I recognize this is ridiculous, can you encode the Geneva Conventions into the military equipment, into the weapons itself? What would that mean? How would you do it? What would be the effect of that? Now, I know what you're thinking. I think the same thing too. It sounds utopian. But how utopian is it? Because when I look around the world, there is a peace tech sector. I spoke to people from Covertis. They're using electronic warfare to blast out Russian drones from the sky by disconnecting it from the person who's the controller in the drone itself so that it crashes. They're created by 2 doctors who don't want to kill people. They want to protect people, and so that's why they created the company. DynaSafe is all about the demilitarization of the systems. They're based in the same area, Sweden, where Alfred Nobel did his research. And they really believe in demilitarization. That's why they're called DynaSafe, Dynamite Safe. B Ventures is a venture capital fund investing only in peace tech initiatives, and is creating software for conflict resolution and conflict prediction. So this is, and of course I should add the Klutz Prize, which is actually rewarding companies that are doing things in peace tech. So this is all very optimistic. But I wonder if this is table stakes, because of course, the metaphor of the shield and the sword are good, but can we go beyond it? Can we actually create weapons that actually somehow lean towards peace, not just conflict? Now, what would that look like in practice? Can we have drones, for example, that only go into areas where there's conflict and battle and actually don't fly because they have geolocation sensors into areas of civilians, that they only fire on aggressors, but they never fire on before that? In terms of proportionality, that it understands what's happening in the conflict and it does things at a reciprocal level. One of the first elements of the Geneva Convention is over prisoners of war and surrender, and you have to accept a reasonable surrender. There's some rules around that, because there always are. But drones today don't accept surrenders. There's cases of accepting surrenders, and you can see those videos online. But there's also cases where they don't do that. And in fact, over the last few days, we've even seen an example where someone had been blown out of Venezuelan people on a ship, on a trawler, had been blown to smithereens, but they were still alive. Technically under the Geneva Conventions, well, actually they wouldn't fit under the Geneva Conventions because they're not uniformed soldiers, but nevertheless, they're hors de combat, right? Because they're injured, you wouldn't actually fire on them. If actually that's the point of it being a war crime, that you're not supposed to, but in fact the US government did. But here, you would say you could actually have a drone that would actually perhaps recognize that they're hors de combat and then show restraint in a way that maybe military commanders wouldn't. So what would this look like in practice? It sounds ridiculous, but could you imagine a world in which you have militias in Africa streaming towards children's schools, about to kidnap them and do worse to the children there, and the UN Profor, the protection force, has their drones hovering up and says, no, you do not pass. We will fire upon you. We're armed. Right? And when they keep going, they then fire, but they fire in non-lethal ways. They knock out their kneecaps. They don't touch their torso or their head, right? And so this sounds ridiculous, but we need to think about these things. And even if it's not right, even if it's not workable, keep in mind that if you're going to add a processor and a network and AI to an instrument of war, one thing you definitely will get will be data. So in terms of the table stakes of international humanitarian law compliance and just recognizing of harm done, that will be collected. It'll be collected quasi-real time or when problems are happening, rather than 2 years later when you're trying to identify the mass grave and the number of bodies that are in it. Can we go beyond dual-use goods, in which we've thought about it in terms of civilian and military goods, for peace goods as well, that triple use, that every weapon has to have this chip in it that recognizes the international humanitarian law. So when Anduril and Helsing go on to stages and talk about what their weapons can do, they also have it embedded, the Geneva Conventions, inside the weapon too. This is not a pacifist idea. Pacifists detested the idea of the League of Nations because it seemed to legitimate war rather than do an end with war. And I would agree that this does the same thing too. It is not a world in which we all lock arms and hope for the best. But the reason why I advocate it is because the nature of war is changing in ways that I don't think we fully appreciate. The idea of human beings making decisions are going away to an environment in which war is becoming too fast, too complex, and too lethal, and the machines are going to be needing to make the decisions themselves. And if we don't find a way to bolster in our values into it, we have a bigger problem on our hands. But I feel optimistic because we've done it before. The Kellogg-Briand Pact and the Pact of Paris was an example in 1928 in which the world came together, and although it seemed to be utopian because a decade later all the signatories to the Paris Peace Pact were bombing each other to smithereens, it also legitimized the use of sanctions rather than war. It enabled economic sanctions to take place instead of war. And need I remind the lawyers in the room that the very first count that gave the Nuremberg tribunal standing was a violation of the Paris Peace Pact. So although we might say this seems laughable, I guarantee in 1850 the idea that you would have an armored vehicle that would be an international organization that would not be fired upon by any of the soldiers seemed laughable too, and that's exactly what we have today. So I think we can look to the future optimistically.